The four-scene arcade. Active.
You know, it was only a matter of time before I got to make a chatty video focusing on the Sony PlayStation, and keeping the magazine theme going, I decided to look at one of the PlayStation-centric gaming mags. The topic for today is PlayStation Plus. Not to be confused with the subscription service of the same name, which is required for online play. PlayStation Plus was a magazine that lasted 62 issues, where it ran from October of 1995 all the way to November of 2000. Distributed by EMAP Images, this unofficial magazine describes itself as the essential guide to PlayStation and more. For this video, I am going to cover the reviews up to issue 49, as they are using the percentage-based ratings. The final 12 issues, which are 50 to 62, follow the more traditional something out of 10 rating system. For this video, I am going to set the maximum to 40%, as some of these are quite surprising or even controversial among the PlayStation community. Strap in folks, the four-scene arcade is proud to present PlayStation Plus Magazine's Worst Rated Games, Part 1. Let's warm up with 6 games that share a 40% rating, shall we? First up is VR Sports Powerboat Racing, originally released in 1998 for PlayStation and Windows. Developed by Promethean Designs Limited, this was Interplay's answer to Sony's own Rapid Racer, which came out a year prior. It features several types of races, including championships and time trials, and each boat comes with their own types and abilities. While both games are arcade-style racers, Rapid Racer is more akin to Ridge Racer, where VR Sports Powerboat Racing is more akin to, say, Need for Speed. A single panel review for VR Sports Powerboat Racing was written by Rob as part of issue 33, where he first wrote that the PlayStation Plus Office Bollocks-o-meter showed lethally high ratings around Interplay's effort, stating that it should be approached with caution as it is considered dangerous and on no account should one pot money for it. And yes, it really did retail at £39.99 when it first came out. One of its criticisms was that every time you do a jump, your boat disappears beneath the waves and then resurfaces. The problem was that this doesn't actually happen to the computer opponent's boats, which he ponders if it was a cunning plan to increase the enjoyment of a game or shoddy programming. Another point against it was that the graphics and performance, as while they are chopping in single player mode, the visuals get really bad when playing on 2-player mode. The game wound up with a 40% rating, with the conclusion stating that as the staff was already seeking those at Promethean Designs and or Interplay responsible for the game, they were hopeful that they would pay for their crimes. PlayStation Plus happens to be one of those magazines that isn't listed as a critic on Moby Games due to its obscurity. Looking at the game's listing, the game has an average score of 57% based on 10 archived ratings. 2 reviews on the 80% territory come from German magazine, Game Express, and Das Officielle PlayStation Magazine, aka Play Fun Magazine, with the former giving the PS1 version the highest score it got with an 82%. The highest score from an English-speaking critic, Gamezilla, gave it a 75 out of 100, stating that VR Sport Powerboat Racing is by no means a game that's terrible or even bad, it is just difficult to get used to. Once you get control of the steering touchiness, you will do much better and start to enjoy the game more. Gamezilla's review also recommended this game. If you are looking for a different type of racing game, you may want to give this one a rental. On the other hand, EGM and GameSpot were a lot more harsh than the already weak score by PlayStation Plus, as it got scores of 14.5 out of 40 and 2.7 out of 10 respectively. The video game critic takes the cake, as the website gave it a really low score of 16% as part of a retro review from 2001. The second 40% game for the segment is Blaze and Blade, a JRPG originally developed by TNE Soft in 1998. Published in Europe by Funsoft a year after its Japanese release, Blaze and Blade Eternal Quest is an action RPG where you control a party of 4. Character creation allows you to define a player's behavior as well as their abilities. Your goal is to venture into the Forbidden Land, formerly known as Phrygia, and deliver the land from evil. Phrygia has been inhabited by monsters and demons since the time of the 12 Wise Men. These monsters and demons often transform into useful items once destroyed. Another review from Rob. This one comes from issue 39, which it goes to a rather nasty way to begin the review by stating that this is a good choice for when you're stuck for a Christmas present for the guy who killed your dad. An idea of a 4-player RPG was odd, though he did admit the concept was pretty nifty, as it makes combat interesting. The problem was that the combat is utter bollocks if you're playing on your own. Besides describing the graphics as piss ugly, he also criticized the game for the utter repetition of going into ancient ruins, killing demons, picking up some cruddy magic items, going back and doing it again ad nauseum. He concludes the review on a 40% rating, stating that only slightly spooky loner types who smell of cat urine will probably like this, and that Blaze and Blade is a graphical ugh with a twist of extreme tedium, which he best described it as essence de bollocks. It's safe to say by now that unlike the review writers at Sega Saturn Magazine UK and Cube Magazine UK, PlayStation Plus Magazine's review writers seem to be in a competition on who has the mouth filthy enough to spout obscenities within each issue. And yeah, we'll be seeing that a lot in this video. Over at Moby Games, the PlayStation version got an average of 68% based on 8 archived ratings. And just like VIA Sports Powerboat Racing, the biggest scores comes from Germany, with 81% from video games and 80% from a retro review at Maniac/M Games. Now Gamer has the highest for English reviews, as the publication gave it a 7.3 out of 10, though they were bummed because if Blaze and Blade had addressed a few of the problems mentioned, if you read the review that is, it would have been a cracker. But sadly, there are stacks of other RPGs which it'll be compared to, and consequently, many of the game's endearing features will never see the light of day. It's a pity, but hey, still a decent score. IGN on the other hand gave it a 4.4 out of 10. Stefan Butts, who reviewed the game, could say so much more about this game, but as his saintly mother used to tell him, if you can't say something nice about someone, try to limit it to 1700 words. At least his review was less harsh than the one from PlayStation Plus, despite the fact that his name sounds like some fake name Bart Simpson will make up when prank calling Mo. Now, this review is where things get pretty nasty. While I was browsing Blue Sky one day, A user named Matt B shared a scan of a review of Mega Man Legends as an example of how British video game magazines were just as mental as British tabloids. The review in particular comes from issue 40 of PlayStation Plus, and good lord, where do I even begin with this one? And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. The review from Rob had no substance, nothing about the game whatsoever, just racist comments and surface level whining. I mean, the Mega Man fandom weren't exactly thrilled about it back in the day for being 3D, or at least not the kind of 3D they were expecting, while the media wasn't pleased by it due to how awkward it was to play, but this is just way over the top. And the most ironic part about the Legends review? The game itself would end up being fondly remembered, which explains why the review, as well as the magazine and the guy reviewing it, fell into obscurity. And all this in spite of the fact that the game was typically rated 5 through 7 out of 10 at best when it was new at the time. I feel that Twilight the Cabot sums up this review quite well. I can't believe there was a time when cynical, joyless reviews like this were just accepted to be the norm. I chuckled at takes like this, thinking they were just jokes, but it's just bitter man-children getting upset over colors? Replace color with woke and it won't be so different from today. You and me both, buddy. You and me both. Reviewed on the very same issue as Mega Man Legends, Mega Man X4 got off much easier, as Rich was in charge of a review. I mean, sure, it also got a 40% score, but at least he was more professional than Rob. And by the way, Rob was a former member of Mean Machines, so he was very much from that toxic lad magazine era of British gaming media. For Rich's review, it isn't too different from what magazines felt about Mega Man during the 32-bit era, complaining how the series is repeating itself too much and needs to retire, or how you shouldn't bother with it because it has bright colors, or more notably, it's a 2D game on the PlayStation, which means it should be avoided like a swarm of mosquitoes during a hot, sunny picnic. What's important to know that during the 32-bit era, 3D was still in its infancy, while 2D was pretty far along by that point. And it makes sense 2D games like Mega Man X4 aged better even to this day. Mega Man wasn't the only robot-related game to get a 40% score in the same issue, as the same thing happened with Shadow Gunner: The Robot Wars. Developed by Vertex Multimedia and published by Ubisoft in 1998, Shadow Gunner: The Robot Wars is a third-person shooter in which you control a giant robot mech. Shadow Gunner's story is set in a far future where mankind has created robots to protect themselves, among other things. But some jerks have also created robots in hope to conquer the world. So it is up to you to defeat those jerks in 3 levels with 5 missions each. What's interesting about Shadow Gunner is that defeating enemy robots will allow you to gain new power-ups and weapons to improve on your firepower. Your robot can be equipped with a jetpack that lets him fly. Levels include both inside and outside locations, which should be a good opportunity to strategize your actions. Rob gave it a similar trashing in his review, as he wasn't impressed with the graphics and the repetition, which was apparently so bad he stated that if the idea of a game where big clunky robots shoot crappy little guns at each other again and again for several hours in comically bad graphics sounded good to you, you'd need to have your head examined, then brutally severed for your own good. Not content with stating that £40 for a CD that's not fit for a beer mat, his conclusion stated that Shadow Gunner looks and plays like a turd, and that you should stick to Metal Mickey, or at least watch Robot Wars on BBC Two if you want high adrenaline robot thrills. Shadow Gunner didn't exactly set the world on fire, given the 56% average on mobile games based on 5 ratings. However, there are no archived English reviews on the site, which means the PlayStation Plus review is the only English review that I can think of. Console Mania, a Spanish publication, gave it an 82 out of 100, making it the highest score from a critic. The score that's lower than PlayStation Plus comes from a French magazine, Joypad, who gave it a 2 out of 10 in their December 1998 issue. For our last 40% review, we now have a game that was published by Sony themselves. Released in 1999 as a PAL exclusive, Bloodlines was developed by Radical Entertainment. The same Radical Entertainment that gave us Independence Day, which was featured on my Sega Saturn Magazine UK video. I actually remember playing the demo of this on a demo disc from issue 44 of the official UK PlayStation magazine, whose same disc also came with demos for Rugrats Search for Reptar, which we will get to much later in this very video, Roll Cage, and 2 other PAL exclusive games, Retro Force and Tank Racer. Set in the far future, competitive sport is outlawed and becomes the pursuit of an underground network of the world's greatest athletes. Inspired by the nations of old, they form clans and engage each other in tribal combat to protect the honor of their bloodlines. And there can only be one winner. In this game, you fight to the death in a last man standing battle against multiple opponents. The environments allow for roaming and hiding, allowing players to tactically attack and run away to evade attacks. Weapons can be found, used and recharged across the area. It functions the same way as Super Smash Bros. Melee, pretty much. This review comes from issue 43, which yet again Rob spews obscenities out of his filthy gob. He describes Bloodlines as kind of like that kid in front of a class who always had his hand up going please with a painfully wrong answer. This wants to be a good game so bad, but no matter how hard he tries, it will never be. While he did praise the visuals, it wasn't enough to save it in his eyes, as he concluded the game with a 40% score, saying that games like this make them sit staring out windows dreaming of better times in lands far away from this vile of tears. Over at Moby Games, Bloodlines sits at a 59% based on 9 ratings. The highest score comes from PlayFun magazine, who gave it a 2.2 out of 6 in their April 1999 issue. Given the odd scoring system from PlayFun magazine, this translated to a 76%. Absolute PlayStation reviewed it on their May 1999 issue, and with a nice 69 out of 100 score, the reviewer stated that as multiplayer games are concerned, Bloodlines offers limited enjoyment, to the point that after playing for an hour or so, the reviewer and the rest of the crew went back to tried and trusted classics like Worms, Bomberman, and Devil Dice. The score that's lower than PlayStation Plus was from the April 1999 issue of the German magazine Video Games, who gave it a 32 out of 100. Let's turn the clock back to the second issue of the magazine, when they were much more detailed with their reviews. This is also our first Japanese import to be featured on this video, starting with Hermie Hopperhead. Developed by Yukes Co. Limited, you take control of the titular Hermie Hopperhead, a young city kid with weird looking red hair that sticks out in all directions. While waiting for his girlfriend, Trish, he happens to spot an egg with arms and legs come leaping out of a nearby garbage can. The bipedal egg coaxes him to come with it, and Hermie is led to another world called Egg World. The world's resident villain, Mad Migo, is trying to take over the world of innocent egg people. What's worse, the evil Migo has taken Hermie's girlfriend Trish hostage. It is now up to Hermie to put a stop to Mad Migo's plans and rescue his girlfriend. While the gameplay is very similar to that of Mario games, where enemies are usually defeated by jumping over them, it does distinguish itself from the Italian plumber with the egg mechanic. You see, some of the egg inhabitants follow the protagonist around and may turn into platforms and other things to help his progress. Although the game did see an average score of 76% on mobile games based on 6 ratings, with pixel-heroes.de giving it a perfect 10 out of 10 on their retro review in 2006, PlayStation Plus wasn't exactly thrilled about that one. After all, they give it a 38% on their second ever issue, which is lower than the 5.3 out of 10 score from the September 1995 issue of Now Gamer. Without getting into too much detail, the magazine review did come with a more detailed rating system. While the magazine gave the music a 67, even if it ain't saying much, the rest of the ratings were pretty middling, especially in regards to lastability. Aside from an overall score of 38%, we get 2 comments from the PlayStation Plus magazine crew. First, we have a comment from Rob, who states that after playing this game for about an hour, that ever so jazzy trumpet starts to sound like the happy-go-lucky music Satan will play as he went about sawing your legs off. At least it starts to sound like this after repeating a level multiple times because you didn't get it right the first time. He also goes out of the way to say that Hermie Hopperhead resembles a hastily ported Amiga game. The other comment comes from Steve, who had this to say regarding this Japan-exclusive platformer. I never thought I'd say it, but I found another game every bit as frustrating as Rayman. Hermie Hopperhead steals ideas from every platform game hero imaginable, but fails at the first hurdle by creating a game so frustrating it defies belief. Take the underwater stages for example. As Hermie swims extremely slowly through the water, speedy fish zoom in, and unless your timing is split second perfect, a life is lost. Similarly, the detection logic is awful, and while it seems as if the Hermie sprite is landing on an enemy to kill it, for no apparent reason the player loses a life instead. There isn't a shred of originality in Hermie Hopperhead, and it is a game the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive would handle with ease. It doesn't even have the benefit of playability to support it, making it one to definitely ignore. Another import review from the early issues, we now look at Mobile Suit Gundam, released in 1995. Developed by Bandai Entertainment Company, which was a joint venture between Bandai and Human Entertainment, Mobile Suit Gundam is the first-person action game that puts you in the shoes of Amuro Ray, the pilot of the RX-78 Gundam, and has you play through the events of the original 1979 animated television show. The aim is simple: eliminate all the enemies to clear each stage. This review comes from Issue 7, or Volume 1, Issue 7, and this one was written by not Rob, but another reviewer who goes by the initials SM. The review starts off with a bizarre statement regarding what their Eastern friends are obsessed with to justify the popularity with typical anime tropes, given the PlayStation Plus staff had been browsing through the Japanese magazines and watching imported manga tapes. Brushing off that weird start aside, the review mentions that Mobile Suit Gundam reveals itself to be a second-rate imitation of Crazy Ivan, which wasn't exactly a top-notch game to begin with. The review criticized the slow movement around the sparse locations, making combat scenes rather long-winded. The other point of criticism was that the landscapes are drab and the action is simply a matter of lining the enemies up on your line of sight, which all gets very dull fast. Mobile Suit Gundam wound up with a 37% rating, as the review concludes that given there was very little chance of a game hitting stores in PAL form, they were once again spared of a release of a dodgy title which fails to live up to a standard set by its impressive FMV intro sequence. Over at Moby Games, Mobile Suit Gundam only got one single review that was archived, and that comes from the September 1995 issue of Super Game Power, a Brazilian magazine that lasted from 1993 to 2005. Unlike PlayStation Plus, Super Game Power gave this game an admittedly decent score of 3.8 out of 5. Since this was the first PlayStation game in the Gundam series, possibly its first 3D outing even, it's understandable given it was from the early days of a console. If you compare this game to the more recent games in the series on PlayStation 4 or even PlayStation 5, it's hard to deny that the Gundam series has come a long way for PlayStation owners since 1995. For this segment, we are dealing with our first double dipper, starting with Galaxian III. Developed by Namco, it originally made its Japanese debut in 1990, which later reached the Western arcades in 1993. It eventually got a PlayStation release in 1996, and that's the version we are dealing with here. This game was reviewed on Volume 1, Issue 9, which also happens to be 2 pages long. The magazine certainly gave it a lot of praise for the graphics, music, and sound effects, but the playability landed with a FUD with a 23% rating. The game got an overall score of 36 out of 100, and once again we have 2 comments from different writers. Matt takes Rob's place on a comment bit, stating that Galaxian 3 is not much of a game that you will play, but rather watch, but even then you'd be better off with a stick and a hoop. He pointed out that the main problem with Galaxian 3 was that it's really designed to be a big screen jaw-dropper given its origins in the arcades. Standing in London's Trocadero, it's hard not to be impressed by the 12-foot wall of stunning visuals. But when you reduce it all down to a 12-inch point-and-click rail shooter, it loses pretty much all of its appeal, ultimately becoming nothing more than a showpiece. Steve's comment wrote that Sony was then currently planning a PAL release of Galaxian 3 for release in August or September, but frankly he wouldn't bother, given that while it's one of the most graphically impressive games, the interaction on the player's part is minimal. He also mentioned that since Sony was charging 40 quid for the PAL release, all you'd be getting was a tarted up version of Starblade, which already ranks as a game best ignored. He concluded his comments stating that Galaxian 3 was a perfect showcase of what the PlayStation can do, but it seemed as if Tekken 2 got all the Namco playability quota, and despite being a very good conversion, it stinks big time when it comes to furthering good old-fashioned gameplay. Over at Moby Games, Galaxian 3 got an average of 53% based on 7 critic ratings. For the PlayStation version anyway, with All Game Guide giving it a 4.5 out of 5 on their retro review from 2014. Super Game Power gets another mention here, as they gave it a 4 out of 5 in their July 1996 issue, but as far as English-speaking critics are concerned, there was one review that scored lower than on PlayStation Plus. In this case, Computer and Video Games, or CVG, gave it a score of 1 out of 5 in their July 1996 issue, stating that the real problem with the port is that it loses the whole effect the arcade version had, playing with a bunch of friends on a massive screen with really loud sound, even in multiplayer mode on a 29-inch TV with a Dolby surround system, which is better than most people will ever get to pay on, doesn't even compare, which just shows off how the game wasn't good in the arcade in the first place. The other game to end up with a 36% score is Mega Man Battle and Chase, which was first released in Japan on March 20th, 1997, with the PAL release coming out a year later. However, this spin-off wouldn't hit North America until 2006, where it was included as a bonus unlockable game as part of a Mega Man X collection for PlayStation 2 and GameCube. The game is a kart racer that's practically similar to Mario Kart, but with a Mega Man twist in that you can steal opponents' vehicle parts and apply them to their own karts. This is the third time everyone's favorite Blue Bomber was given a shaft by PlayStation Plus magazine on this video, arguably having a worse reception than Mega Man Legends and X4. Spanning over 2 pages, this review was from the October 1997 issue, where John got to try this game. The very first thing he brought up was the fact that Mega Man Battle and Chase was selling the PlayStation short as far as kart racers are concerned. He wrote that while the PlayStation is a superb machine, capable of blinding games, when you compare Mega Man Battle and Chase to Mario Kart 64, it makes Sony's system look like. Keep in mind that this was in 1998, and it wouldn't be until a year later when both Crash Team Racing and Speed Freaks will scratch that kart racing itch for PlayStation owners. John also criticized the game for the wooden way the cars handle, and the game being very dull to play overall, despite loads of options, upgrades, and plenty of tracks. The publication also wrote that why anyone bothered to release this game was a mystery. It might sell in Japan given that Mega Man often saw a lot of popularity, but in Europe, not so much. Also, I found it interesting the magazine refers to Ocean as a publisher for the PAL release, as the company would later be bought out by Infogrames. And since GT64 Championship Edition was the last game to be published by the company as Ocean, this might explain why the PAL release is published under Infogrames. Oh, and in case you were wondering, what used to be Ocean Software was later sold off to Bandai Namco, who now serves as the UK branch of the house that Pac-Man built, mainly for distributing their games for European audiences. Over at Moby Games, the game has an average score of 65% based on 9 critic reviews. The French magazine, Consoles Plus, gave it a 75 out of 100 on their November 1998 issue, making this one the highest scoring review. GameSpot gave it a 7.3 out of 10 on April 29, 1997, which basically counts as an import review, given its PAL version was yet to be released. However, NowGamer gave the original Japanese version a 4.2 out of 10 in their March 1997 issue, suggesting that if you'd want to do actual battling and chasing, you'd be better off with Twisted Metal 2, while Mega Man should stick to platform games. For our next segment, we have 7 games that received a 35% score, starting with NASCAR Racing. Released in 1996 and published by Sierra Online, this racing game was developed by Papyrus Design Group, who mainly specialized in racing games, mostly NASCAR titles. And although the 2003 edition was their last game and wound up being shut down by Vivendi Universal in May of 2004, David Kamer bought back the source code and assets for his new company, which we now know as iRacing.com Motorsport Simulations. This one is obviously themed around the 1996 season of NASCAR, and this contains 16 licensed tracks, 3 of which also having nighttime versions, 2 fantasy tracks, 20 real NASCAR drivers from said season, as well as 3 modes: arcade, simulation race, and simulation testing. As a matter of fact, it was the first NASCAR game to be released for any PlayStation console. However, this didn't actually get a PAL release, so that technically counts as an import. Although it doesn't mention who wrote it, the review came from issue 16. Since the PlayStation had recently played host to both Psygnosis, Destruction Derby 2, and EA's Andretti Racing, NASCAR Racing was poised to do one better than the latter in terms of realism, in hopes that it would dethrone Formula 1, also by Psygnosis. However, the magazine review mentioned a crucial difference between this and other racing games that were mentioned. NASCAR Racing was crap. The review pointed out that the game didn't just have a few disappointing flaws, it's that the game is completely debilitated by an engine that's so bad you almost feel sorry for it. The first thing the magazine criticized NASCAR Racing for was the engine, which was meant to do more or less the same job as that of Destruction Derby 2, with 20 cars on a track with a bit of scenery. The problem was that unlike Destruction Derby 2, this game doesn't bother about any real 3D, and the cars don't leave the track or flip over. You would assume that under normal circumstances it wouldn't be a problem for the PlayStation, but this game's engine was clearly not up to par. For example, when you use the in-car view, everything jerks about like a chronic DT sufferer, so switching to a behind-car view should be a lot better, until something like a straight comes onto the screen. The other thing that was criticized was the simulation mode being a slow, dull, predictable affair, with the arcade mode being more or less the same thing, except you get to bash the cars without slowing down like in Destruction Derby. The other problems were that the tracks weren't interesting, and unlike Andretti Racing, stock cars are the only vehicles that you can drive. The reviews also goes to mention that since there are so many better racing games on the PlayStation, NASCAR Racing is quote-unquote spatial in a sense that if you took a PlayStation back to the year of 1987 and designed a racing game, it will probably have been a suitable answer. The review concluded with an overall score of 35%, with the same score being given to the game's last ability, while also stating that compared with the comparative slickness of the games mentioned before, NASCAR Racing looks to be a very sorry alternative indeed. There was also an opinion part from TC, saying that while it doesn't look too ropey in the screenshots, NASCAR Racing looks truly horrible when in motion, stating it's actually a chore to play, and with so many other top racers already available on the PlayStation, you'd have to have a very unusual taste indeed to go out and pay good money for this. Again, this game was never released in PAL regions, though it was going to retail for 45 quid. The reception was pretty mixed on this one, according to the MobyGames average score based on 10 ratings. GameSpot gave this the highest score for a game with an 8.1 out of 10, which also went as far as to call it a new standard in 32-bit auto racing sims. Quite a bold statement for a game whose PAL release was scrapped. However, 2 publications gave this one scores that are lower than that of PlayStation Plus, with Das Officiel PlayStation magazine giving it a 4.7 out of 6, which translates to a 26%, while Game Revolution gave it a 16 out of 100 in their retro review from 2004, stating that unless you are an extreme NASCAR fanatic, PlayStation owners should just play Wipeout XL, aka Wipeout 2097, if they are looking for fun on a racetrack. Our next game is Nagano Winter Olympics, the official game of the 18th Olympic Winter Games held in Nagano, Japan. Released in 1997 and developed by Konami, this sports game saw a mixed reception, with 58% average based on 17 ratings. While GameSpot and IGN gave the PlayStation version the slightly worse scores of 3.3 out of 10 and 3 out of 10 respectively, the review from the March 1998 issue of PlayStation Plus certainly didn't help matters. Yet another review from Rob, this one is 4 pages long, with the opening line saying that you would expect the Olympic Games to be like a selection box where you can choose between different sporting events, but with Nagano Winter Olympics, they got maggoty lobs of dung standing in for strawberry creams. Describing the game like those tests they do on lab rats, where they make them press buttons at high speeds to get little lumps of cheese, Nagano Winter Olympics is actually a sequel to International Track and Field, where speedy button mashing is the high priority. The difference being that unlike the predecessor, where it was fun and frantic, Nagano Winter Olympics was repetitive and crap, with the rest of the stuff being so simple even a lab rat will probably wing it. Going through the events, he describes snowboarding as slow, drab, and appalling, while it looks nothing like snowboarding whatsoever, downhill skiing being slow and dull. Trick jumping was described as the PlayStation equivalent of typing in 10 number codes on the telephone, and ski jumping being, well, ski jumping. The only events that Rob found fun were skating and curling, which only made the PlayStation Plus staff notice even more what utter garbage the rest of them were. He concluded the review with a score of 35%, stating that Nagano Winter Olympics is less fun than having your family jewels clapped between 2 bricks, and with no actual gameplay, he suggested that you'd be better off with Scrabble if you are looking for multiplayer thrills. Next, we have a PAL exclusive point-and-click adventure game with The Last Report, which comes to us from Microids. Originally released on MS-DOS in 1996 as Evidence: The Last Report, this was ported to the PlayStation the following year. You take on the role of Daniel Singer, a reporter for Channel Z, whose former girlfriend and co-worker Sarah Hopkins has been murdered, and because he recently broke up with her, he is considered to be the prime suspect. So it's up to you to help Daniel discover the real killer. But keep your eyes peeled, as there are people in high places involved that will try to stop him from proving his innocence. This review comes from issue 31, with Nick being assigned to the task of playing the PlayStation port. Since The Last Report is meant to be all atmosphere and suspense, Nick was annoyed about the fact that you constantly die without warning. While he did write that the visuals look good, he also mentioned that the puzzles were not very good, especially when compared to other point-and-click adventure games that came before it, like Discworld or Broken Sword. The page also has a "we like to say" bit, asking why has this game been made, let alone ported to the PlayStation, calling the last report as gripping as songs of praise, with no motivation to play on, with the player ending up not giving a toss if Dan dies or if he finds his ex's killer. No thrills, no comedy, no game. The review concluded at a 35% score, with Nick saying that you should avoid the last report like you'd avoid an 80s hairstyle. Over at Moby Games, the PlayStation port got a 55% average from 8 archived ratings. Since Microids is based in France, it's no shocker to know that their games usually got a better reception there. Case in point, the console port of The Last Report got stellar reviews from French publications like Consoles Plus, Consoles News, and Player One. Germany, on the other hand, wasn't impressed by the port, as the terrible scores were given out by Fun Generation, Megafun, and Maniac, the latter of which giving it a 46 out of 100 in their retro review from 2019. The only archived review from an English-speaking magazine comes from NowGamer, who gave it a putrid 2.7 out of 10, which was worse than Nick's review on PlayStation Plus, with the review score even stating that the game might as well be called The Last Resort. Ayrton Senna Kart Duel 2 is our next game to get a 35% score from PlayStation Plus. Developed by Gaps Incorporated and published by Sunsoft, this is a follow-up to the 1996 original. Like before, it is a 3D kart racing game named after famous Brazilian kart and Formula 1 racer Ayrton Senna. The game features a time attack mode, versus battle mode, and a Grand Prix mode, the latter of which containing 3 classes. With good results, you can promote to higher classes, and there are 8 tracks that can be raced on and 3 difficulty settings. A single panel review comes from issue 35, and this time comes to us from Martin, whose introduction states that if Gran Turismo is the Michael Schumacher of racing games, then Ayrton Senna Kart Duel 2 is that daft Welsh woman from a local driving school wearing a tacky jumper. The gameplay is described as below bog standard, even going as far as calling it possibly one of the worst racing games ever, with its ugly graphics, being able to drive through other cars at times, shoddy courses, poor controls, and the list goes on and on and on, thus landing it with a 35%. Besides a middling score of 4.9 out of 10 from Power Unlimited, the reception was rather mid at best on Moby Games, with it having an average score of 65% based on 6 archived ratings. The majority of scores were between 60 and 68%, with the only positive review coming from Super Wegos, which gave it an 86 out of 100 in their May 1998 issue. Next up is Monkey Hero, one of many games based on a journey to the West. Released in 1999 by Take-Two Interactive, this was developed by Blam, which was their first and only original game they ever developed. Prior to Monkey Hero, they previously handled additional designs for Off-World Interceptor and Bug 2. Monkey Hero was reviewed on issue 41, this time with Lee being tasked to handle it, who right away, he originally thought he was reviewing a Japan-only import, only to find out that it was actually a multi-regional release. Besides criticizing the plot, Lee described the gameplay that it's like Tomb Raider if it was designed to challenge those with a mental capacity greater than that of an amoeba. He also criticized the graphics that stink worse than someone's knob cheese, the patronizing logic, puzzles, and the fact that there is not a single monkey in the game whatsoever, despite the game being called Monkey Hero. The review concluded on a 35% score, with Lee stating it's just about as appealing as having your balls butchered with a rusty blade. Over at Moby Games, this have an average score of 57% based on 12 ratings, with German magazines Video Games, Das Officielle PlayStation Magazine / Play Fun Magazine, and Mega Fun giving it pretty decent scores. On the other hand, the scores from EGM, GameSpot, and IGN were just as harsh as Lee's review, with IGN giving it a 3 out of 10. Known in Japan as Night End Baby, Guardians Crusade comes to us from Tamsoft Corporation, the same studio behind the early installments for Korokyu and Toshinden for Takara. Released in 1998, this was the studio's first original game, with Activision handling its Western release a year later, but the game sold below their expectations and they haven't made any original IPs ever since. The Western release was reviewed on issue 44, with Lee stating that the massive appeal of games like Final Fantasy VII lies in two basic ingredients: flash graphics and a cool storyline. Guardians Crusade takes these two elements and adds a new feature of its own: tedium. All the boring stuff, as he puts it, is broken up by an occasional bout of fisticuffs, which is your typical JRPG affair. There was not much to say in a single panel, as the game was given a 35%, with Lee concluding that Guardians Crusade is about as appealing as a session with Vanessa Feltz. The game's Moby Games score lies at an average of 67% based on 17 reviews, with Gamezilla, RPG Fan, IGN, Absolute PlayStation, Video Games Germany, and Das Officielle PlayStation Magazine all giving very positive reviews. PlayStation Plus, however, remains the lowest score, but Now Gamer and the Gaming Intelligence Agency were mostly negative with their reviews, giving it a 4 out of 10 and 2 out of 5 respectively. And finally, we wrap up the games in the 35% zone with Bomberman Fantasy Race. Developed by Graphic Research and published by Hudson Soft in 1998, with Virgin Interactive handling distribution in Europe, it's a racing game that has you riding the big loping kangaroos, the Louis, and giant blue rabbity dinosaurs, the Teras. As you ride them in each race, you can also blast opponents away with bombs and collect power-ups to even the odds. Reviewed in issue 45, Rob calls this one to be a game too far for Bomberman. For starters, he describes the graphics to be like a 24-karat trotter, with even the animation being cruddy. The Louis, which Rob mistook them for rabbits when they are kangaroos, corner like bricks and slide all over the place, while the bomb mechanic is seen to be very irritating due to the way you have to aim and shoot. Not to mention the power-ups were too shoddy to enjoy using them. Rob concluded his review with a 35% rating, stating that since the PlayStation Plus staff kinda like Bomberman, they were willing to overlook a couple of flaws in this, but sadly, it was almost entirely made up of flaws. The game's critical reception on Moby Games was pretty mediocre, with a 55% average based on 17 ratings. PSX Nation and Fun Generation found it to be a blast, no pun intended, with scores of 81 out of 100 and 4 out of 5 respectively. Most of the other reviews were mostly between 60 to 76 at best, and a couple of scores in the 50s and 40s. the publications that gave it worse scores than PlayStation Plus come from NowGamer, Random Access, CVG, and Megafun. NowGamer and Random Access both gave it 2 out of 10, with the former saying that even with split screen and a wagering system, you'd find more sense-stimulating excitement in the morgue, while CVG gave it a 1 out of 5. Megafun, a German magazine, gave it the absolutely scathing score of 18 out of 100 in their August 1998 issue, who had this to say when translated to English. Sorry Hudson, but Fantasy Race gives me the same feeling as a New Year's Eve cracker that doesn't explode. Quite apart from the poor technical implementation, like angular characters, lens flare effects that don't deserve the name, and annoying background sound, Bomberman Fantasy Race doesn't set any standards in terms of gameplay either. The small number of tracks may only have an effect in single player mode, but the spongy controls for the mouse and sometimes ill-considered track design also minimize the fun in multiplayer. For our second double dipper, we start with the first soccer game on the video, and an obscure one at that. Published and developed by Eidos in 1997 as a PAL exclusive, All-Star Soccer allows you to create your very own dream team in terms of both physical appearance and playing style. The choice of a player's head, some of which are caricatures of top sporting stars, determines mental attributes. Physical attributes are affected by your choice of body and legs, which affect speed, acceleration, shooting, heading, tackling, and stamina. In addition, you can configure almost every aspect of a team's tactical play. These include team formations, set pieces, playing styles, and player marking. Once you have constructed a team, you can move them onto the field and take part in various modes of cup and league play. There are a wealth of option menus to wade through, which allow you to tinker with every aspect of a game. Rules of play, leniency of the referee, injuries, fouls, and there is even an option to turn up the on-field violence. There's barely any detailed information on this game other than a page on PlayStation Data Center. Heck, its Moby Games page doesn't even have credits, covers, or screenshots. And yet, it did have 4 archived reviews, and their scores are all over the place. Absolute PlayStation gave it a 75 out of 100 in their November 1997 issue, while the rest of them were all from German publications, with Fun Generation giving it a 3 out of 10. PlayStation Plus seems to be the only English magazine to give it a negative score, as far as I know, as it was reviewed on Volume 2, Issue 12. The review starts off saying that humor and football go together about as well as custard and pork chops. Those so-called funny football gags videos cluttering up the bargain bins at W.H. Smith's, Nick Hancock quipping between dozens of footballers having fights or falling to the ground face first, even the mightiest of comedy gods will fail to raise a smile. Basically the sports equivalent of those unfunny memes some drunkard or dumpling head will post on TikTok or Facebook to try to be the hip with the youths. Needless to say, Eidos thought it would be a good idea to make a football sim that's as lame as the repetitive humor on offer. And yeah, they made a huge mistake. The review wrote that rather than retread the polygonal route of Soccer 97 or ISS Pro, Eidos had used sprites, which are easier to add detail to than polygons. However, that decision made the game look a tad dated, which made it look like an old Atari ST game endorsed by Peter Beardsley, with the small sprites showing the lack of animation frames. When the only good thing about the game is the character editor, you know something went seriously wrong. The review caps off with a 34% rating, concluding that All-Star Soccer is a very dated and frustrating game built on a very dodgy premise. Football and humor rarely mix, and if you are going to attempt it on a PlayStation, at least ensure the actual game is a step up from the likes of ISS Pro. But as it stands, All-Star Soccer failed on all fronts, and given the obscurity of a game and the lack of info on its sales, it's safe to say that IDOS found out the hard way that the joke's on them. The other 34%er on the video is Bugriders: The Race of Kings, which recently saw a digital re-release on Steam and GOG.com by the folks at Pico Interactive. Originally released in 1997 by GT Interactive, Bugriders was developed by N-Space, the same studio behind Duke Nukem Time to Kill and its follow-up Land of the Babes. They also developed Sword Coast Legends in 2015, which was their final game before they closed down in 2016, which was also the year it got ported to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. In Bugriders, you choose a character and his or her bug and race through 6 tracks that make up the Great Race, where the winner will be crowned the next Emperor of Endymion. Instead of having a normal accelerate button, you must crop your bug to make it go faster. But watch out, you don't want to overdo it because it will become angry and refuse to obey you. You can pull on the reins to slow down. It's a bit like being a horse jockey, if the horses were insects so big that no amount of Raid or Mortine would knock them down dead. The 6 tracks are filled with shortcuts and power-up items such as missiles and bombs to blast away your opponents. You also must fly through as many time rings as you can to add time to the clock, or you won't be able to finish the race. While it was a pretty interesting idea, the critics were pretty much divided over its execution, given the game's average score of 55% on Moby Games. While Player 1, Consoles Plus, and Megafun seemed to enjoy it with their positive scores, most of the publications had mixed thoughts on the idea of riding a 10-foot insect. IGN in particular gave it a 3 out of 10, while the official US PlayStation magazine, which I will make a video on their reviews in the future, gave it 2 discs out of a possible 5. And then we have PlayStation Plus, as the review was written by Nick on issue 33, who decided to squish this game with a giant metaphorical fly swatter. He criticized the game for the idea that you have to whip the bug like a madman, which while at the same time makes steering harder. And the steering was crap anyway. Other than the ropey graphics and the frustration with passing through the rings, he also criticized the 2-player mode as being virtually unplayable because of a questionable viewpoint, while extermination mode is only fun for about 5 minutes. He concluded the review with a score of 34%, with him stating that Bugriders is an insult to the PlayStation due to it being badly conceived, irritating to play, and a dog to look at, while also suggesting that if anybody buys you this, kill them slowly and then take it back to the shop. For this triple feature, we are dealing with 2 soccer games in one segment, as well as a movie tie-in sandwiched in the middle. First we have Hyperformation Soccer, originally developed by Human Entertainment in 1995. In Hyperformation Soccer, you can choose one of the national teams from all around the world and participate on exhibition matches, World Cup and Human Cup, The game features the usual options such as match length and draw rules, as well as defining different weather effects, and so on. Since this is another one of those Japanese imports, only 2 reviews were archived on Moby Games. While Super Game Power gave it a 3.2 out of 5 in their December 1996 issue, Fun Generation gave it a 2 out of 10 a year before. The PlayStation Plus review comes from the 4th issue of the magazine, where SM, when asked what pain is, answered that you may be imagining a toothache or severe burning sensation in your genitals, but the pain is only reached by playing games like Hyperformation Soccer. Since they previously made complaints towards Striker and Goalstorm, SM claimed that Human's imported bucket of crap made those games look like they can be compared with the greatest games of all time. Many complaints include the controls over passing and shooting being over-complex that result in the ball flying into orbit if the button is held down for a second too long, the irksome nature of controlling 2 players at once, the bare-bones gameplay, and the goalie's AI proving to be incredibly dim. What's interesting is that Human Entertainment had plans to release Hyperformation Soccer to PAL regions, which promised loads of improvements over the Japanese version. Regardless, it wound up with a score of 33%, and the plans for the PAL release were scrapped. Developed by Grey Matter, the Canadian studio behind Bob, The Falls of Ali, Phoenix 3, and Perfect Weapon, The Crow: City of Angels is a beat-em-up based on the movie of the same name. As it is a tie-in to a movie which came from the early days of PlayStation, it's not a shock to know that Acclaim was publishing it. Now, you might have seen the Angry Video Game Nerd cover the Sega Saturn version of the game before, so naturally, I get to cover the PlayStation version. Taking on the role of Ash, who was brought back from the dead by the mysterious Crow, the goal is to avenge the death of him and his son at the hands of the minions of Judah, the city's crime lord. The review from issue 2, volume 9 was pretty short, so from what I can work with, the game was criticized for the awkward movement of motion captured characters, with Ash in particular being as stiff as a board, the bizarre and useless camera angles, dull and poorly defined backgrounds, and the game generally being annoyingly repetitive. The game wound up with a 33%, and sheesh, given the game used to retail for 45 quid, I doubt that even I will have bought this game out of sheer curiosity. The other critic scores weren't all that confident about it either, as the game has an average score of 52% based on 18 ratings over at Moby Games. While most reviews from critics were mixed to negative, Game Revolution gave it an eye-opening 0%, who had this to say on the PlayStation version. It is mind-boggling that the same company who gave us Turok Dinosaur Hunter, with its tight, accurate polygons, could also release this turkey the very same month. Acclaim, I say unto you, have you no shame? Simply put, The Crow: City of Angels is one of the worst titles I've ever seen. Avoid all contact with this game. Should contact occur, immediately rinse with water and consult a physician.
Relax! Relax!
Back to some footy action, we now have Super Match Soccer, developed by Cranberry Source and published by, you guessed it, Acclaim. Here's a fun fact, it was originally meant to be a successor to Match Day 2 for the ZX Spectrum, as both games were made by John Rittman. But due to legal reasons, that intention was dropped shortly before it hit store shelves. Released in 1998 for PlayStation and Windows, Super Match Soccer is an action-oriented soccer simulation which has one major difference to other soccer games of its time: the pass system. Instead of the usual separate buttons for passing and shooting, there are 3 levels of shooting intensity which depend on how long the button is pressed. And there is also no semi-automatic passing. The player has to aim himself. Beyond that, the match control is genre standard. Button combinations result in tricks like back heels or lobs, and with a sprint button, a player can run fast for a limited time. Looking at its average score on Moby Games, oh boy, that score of 39% is not looking good. All the reviews gave it the red card for Super Match Soccer, with Mega Fun and Fun Generation giving it a 30 out of 100 and a 3 out of 10 respectively. And its PlayStation Plus review from issue 34 was equally scathing, with John claiming it must have been made by people who hate the beautiful game. His first header said that if World League Soccer and World Cup 98 are at the top of a premiership, and Three Lions is languishing in a Vauxhall conference, Super Match Soccer is to be pissed to even play in the local pub side. With the criticism toward the bloody dreadful graphics, players moving like dribbling geriatrics with Parkinson's disease, and the fact that the only buttons you can use are just for kicking the ball, John ends the review with a 33%. As he stated that it's ugly with no commentary or realistic teams, only a couple of stadiums, and to top things off, it's a yawn to play. For this double segment, we start with a game that Sony themselves had particularly high expectations, given the fact that they hyped the game in the United States. This was the game that was shown for that one PlayStation Underground video on how character models were made with the technology at the time. But when it did come out in 1997, the folks at Sony Interactive Studios America, later known as 989 Studios, completely dropped the ball the exact same way they will do with Twisted Metal 3 the following year. That might explain why EGM gave it an award for worst use of a license in their 1999 buyer's guide. As a matter of fact, the Moby Games average score lies at a 34%, with 15 out of 17 archived reviews being below 50%. Game players / ultra game players in particular gave it a score of 9% in their online review from 1998. With Julian Rignall wondering how could a game that looks and plays so utterly badly manage to get through Sony's quality assurance tests. And just when Spawn's PlayStation debut couldn't get any more bad luck, here comes PlayStation Plus with an equally scathing review from issue 34. Andrew began the review saying that some programmer somewhere probably woke up at 3 AM one day thinking, I've got this really cool comic character to work with. How can I cock up the game? After his criticism of the gameplay and its modes, the game ended up with a 32% score, with Andrew calling it lifeless, pointless, and badly misconceived, with even hardcore adventure buffs will find themselves back at the shop claiming an ant bought me this. The other 32%er on the video, Eliminator, comes to us from Psygnosis in 1998. This one was developed by Magenta Software, the same studio behind Muppet Monster Adventure, Stuart Little 2, the PlayStation version of Disney's Treasure Planet, the first 3 Buzz Jr. games, and Invisimals: The Lost Kingdom. As a matter of fact, this was the first game to be developed by Magenta Software themselves, as prior to Eliminator, they created the graphics engine for Highlander: The Last of the Macleods, a Jaguar CD game based on an animated TV series, which itself is based on a movie. Since this is essentially a basic shoot-'em-up game, Eliminator puts you in control of an experimental hovering craft running the gauntlet of various courses, dodging obstacles, and blowing up opponents in an attempt to reach the end before an onboard bomb blows you up and out the game. The game scored an average of 48% on Moby Games, with most scores being naff at best. A German magazine, Bravo Screen Fun, gave it a 5 out of 6 in their March 1998 issue, which basically translates to 20%. Seriously, what is it with German magazines and their bizarre scoring systems? Eliminator was reviewed as part of issue 42, with Rob immediately calling it to be just as appealing as licking people's ingrown toenails. The first paragraph stated that shoot-'em-ups were kind of getting a bit flabby by 1998. What the PlayStation Plus writing staff was hoping to see was some youngling cub blasters bristling with new ideas, only for them to end up with Eliminator, which he calls it the shoot-'em-up equivalent of Fat Elvis. With the criticism toward basic controls being shoddy, the lack of originality, and the fact that it's a shoot-'em-up with a timer on each level, the game got a 32%, with Rob suggesting that you'd head to your local game shop immediately and stick a bogey on the boxes of Eliminator as a way to spread the word to others on how drab, dull, and generally piss poor it is. "12 games in a single segment, all with a 30% rating? Sheesh, as if I hadn't got enough games to talk about for this video alone. I guess the folks at PlayStation Plus were very fond of number 30. And to start this gigantic segment, we'll start with Bubsy 3D, the Citizen Kane of bad PlayStation games. Released in 1996, this was from the early days of Siphon Filter and Days Gone developer Bend Studios, when they were known as Eidetic at the time. Although this was their PlayStation debut, this is actually the third game they developed, as prior to Bubsy 3D, they previously worked on Live Action Football for Windows 3.1, also published by Accolade, and Columbo's Mystery Capers for the Apple Newton. Despite their reputation as one of the worst games of all time, the Moby Games average score stands at a 50%, which basically makes it a mediocre game at best. And in contrary to popular belief, the game really did get the Gold X award from PS Extreme, which Accolade was proud enough to show on the box for its US release. The reason why a lot of people believe that both the award and the publication was made up by Accolade was because the magazine wasn't exactly popular compared to, say, the official US PlayStation magazine or PSM. Thankfully, the magazine itself has all its issues archived online, and I can indeed confirm that the glowing review came from December 1996. It even shared the same 93% score as Pandemonium, developed by Toys for Bob, in the very same issue. Maybe I could make a video about its worst rated games someday. And PS Extreme wasn't the only one to give it a darn good score despite its reputation either. Play UK gave it an 82% in the same month of 1996, Gamezilla gave it an 81%, and GameFan magazine gave it a 239 out of a 300, which translates to an 80%. Super Wegos gave it a 75%, while 3 European magazines gave it 70 and a 7 out of 10. The magazines being Power Unlimited from the Netherlands, Acau Games from Brazil, and Hobby Consolas in Spain. But aside from Now Gamer's very nice score of 6.9 out of 10, teehee, the rest were either mixed at best, with scores between 50 to 67%, and at worst being poor with 40% and below. PlayStation Power in particular gave it a 7 out of 100, which is also their only review that was archived on Moby Games. I always find it funny how public perception changes as time goes by, as what's considered one of the worst games of all time actually had a slightly better reception at best. Anyway, the PlayStation Plus review comes to us from the January 1998 issue, which happens to be published sometime after the PAL release by Telstar in August of 1997. Nick's review gave the game a beating in the gameplay department, saying the game looks like a pensioner in a being slow contest, as well as criticizing the loose controls, the two-player mode, the humor, and the visuals. With the game being referred as frustrating, badly designed, and about as fun as dental surgery, Nick slapped the game with a catastrophic score of 30%, stating that if you buy this, the staff at PlayStation Plus will visit you and hurt you. He also concluded that Bubsy 3D was one of the biggest pile of crap since the last Swedish anime contest, and that games like this make a Tamagotchi seem fun. And to think Limited Run Games is bringing this to modern platforms via the Perfect Collection. Reviewed in the very same issue as Bubsy 3D, we now get to look at Lethal Enforcers, a compilation that features arcade conversions of both Lethal Enforcers and its sequel, Lethal Enforcers 2 Gunfighters. Released in 1997, this was ported to the PlayStation by Konami's Chicago division, who also developed Broken Helix, Project Overkill, and the Bottom of the Night series. The games are gallery shooters, and they both share a similar gameplay structure, with digitized enemy targets popping up on screen and simply needing to be shot down before they take a shot at you. The original game places you as a 1990s police officer fighting bank robbers, the Chinese mafia, and drug dealers, while in the sequel, you are now a sheriff up against more bank robbers and wrongdoers, but now set in the Old West. While the PlayStation ports can be played with a standard controller, it was also compatible with a Konami Hyperplaster light gun for a more authentic feel, provided you're playing on an old CRTV telly, as light guns do not work well with modern televisions. With the exception of Consoles Plus and Acau Games, the compilation saw a rather middling reception, with a 53% average on Moby Games. And while IGN gave it a 4 out of 10, and Consoles News giving it a 40%, PlayStation Plus has the lowest score the compilation could get, as Rob criticized the games for being dull, repetitive, and piss poor in almost every way in both graphics and gameplay. With a score of 30%, Rob summed up Lethal Enforcers to be an arcade conversion that captures the awfulness of the original, and it manages to make killing about as interesting as doing the laundry. Originally released in arcades in 1996, Yusha Heaven's Gate was a fighting game developed by Rakjin Co., who nowadays serves as a support studio. In recent years, they have been helping out several Japanese studios with some notable games, including Gravity Rush 2, Final Fantasy Explorers, Sword Art Online Fractured Daydream, and most recently, Mario & Luigi Brothership. While Yusha Heaven's Gate first saw a PlayStation port the same year as its original arcade version, both of which published by Atlus, the game was localized for PAL regions in 1997, with JVC Music Europe in charge of distribution. With the PAL release seeing an average score of 61%, the game had a rather okay reception, with most scores being at either 60 or 70% mark. Megafon gave this one a 74%, while CVG gave it the weakest score of 1 out of 5 in the March 1998 issue. PlayStation Plus gave the PAL release a slightly better score of 30%, but with Nick reviewing this for the February 1998 issue, that's not saying much. The first thing he did is call the game the door-to-door salesman of fighting games. Unwanted, frustrating, and dull. In a massive feast of fighting games on the PlayStation, what food would each game be? According to Nick, Tekken 2 would be a sweet, creamy dessert, the Street Fighter games will be the meat and 2 veg, while Heaven's Gate will be the manky sprouts nobody ever eats. So would Bloodlines I talked about earlier will be the soggy goulash if that's the case? His first strike against Yusha is that it's dull, with no originality in sight, and it played like a dog. With other points of criticism being the combos being too fiddly to be much of use, the paltry roster of only 8 characters that looked like they just had their Soul Blade and or Street Fighter auditions rejected, and the naff graphics. It's sad when the backgrounds are better than the game itself. Nick ended the review with a 30%, saying that, like Ginger Spice's boobs, the PlayStation Plus staff has seen it all before, and now they want something new and a bit tastier. Our next game to get a 30% score is World League Basketball, originally released for PC and PlayStation in 1997 by Mindscape, with the PAL release coming out the following year. Developed by High Voltage Software, the same studio behind several family-friendly games like LEGO Racers, Ben 10 Protector of Earth, and Leisure Suit Larry Magna Cum Laude, World League Basketball was part of the Mindscape Sports Advantage series. The only other game I can find in the series online, at least as far as I know, was Aaron vs. Roof Battle of the Big Bats, a PC exclusive game developed by NewFX, an Illinois-based studio who later became part of EA's Chicago division, which was closed down in November of 2007. 9 months after the release of Def Jam Icon for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It seems like this is another PlayStation game that isn't talked about as much, as the only archived review on Moby Games comes from Das Officiel PlayStation Magazine, as they give it a 3.6 out of 6, which basically translates to 52%. The only English review of the PlayStation version comes from the February 1998 issue of PlayStation Plus. Yes, the same issue as Yusha that I just talked about earlier. John's review doesn't mess around when he says that World League Basketball sucks. It lacks excitement, it looks dull, and worst of all, it's got toilet gameplay. To give us an example, when you get a foul, you step to free throw. No power bar or shot angle, just push square and the ball may or may not sink. Not to mention the selection of camera angles made playing the game virtually impossible. He concluded the review with a score of 30%, stating that for a game that is jerky and very rough around the edges, it might be forgivable if it had quality gameplay, but unfortunately, that was definitely not the case. Congratulations, Mindscape! You guys somehow managed to make Acclaim's tie-in to Space Jam not only look like a Game of the Year winner at the Golden Joystick Awards, but somehow having Acclaim earn the Nobel Peace Prize. Sticking with basketball games, we now have NBA Pro 98. Known as NBA in the Zone 98 in the US and NBA Power Dunkers 3 in Japan, this was part of Konami's XXL Sports series and features all the teams and players from the NBA for the 1997 and 1998 season, allowing exhibition, season, playoff, and all-star modes. Unlike the other basketball game that we just looked at, NBA Pro 98 actually had a pretty positive reception, with an average of 73% on mobile games. However, PlayStation Plus just ain't having it, if the review from issue 31 is anything to go by. Rob had criticized practically everything, including the gameplay, replays, options, controls, the random nature of Donkey the Ball, and the overall game being so boring it hurts. Slapping a score of 30% on this game, Rob concluded that NBA Pro 98 is slow and deadly, as in really boring. Bad basketball games give the PlayStation Plus writer crew migraines, and this game had been causing searing head across their office. Oh boy, this is definitely going to upset a lot of SNK fans out there, as Rob was none too pleased when he reviewed Real Bout Fatal Fury in issue 31. As we all know, Real Bout Fatal Fury made its debut in the arcades in 1995, and it saw a lot of re-releases of ports since then, even on iOS and Android devices. The 1997 PlayStation port of Real Bout Fatal Fury was published in PAL regions by Sony themselves, but this one wasn't sold in stores in a traditional sense in the UK. The UK release was only available at rental stores like Blockbuster or HMV, though it was thankfully available to buy for keeps in Germany, at least according to what I can find online. As such, the PlayStation Plus review is for the rental-only UK release, and Rob had quite a mouthful in a single page. The first thing he wrote about is how the game looks like it came from an age when game consoles weighed about 10 stone, were the size of cupboards, and had to be hand-cranked to start them up, which, according to him, is slow, badly animated, and basic as they come. The other criticism was toward the characters. He wrote that he could have forgiven the game for looking a little primitive, but the characters aren't interesting and there aren't enough of them. Obviously, I have no idea how much it cost to rent the game back then, but Rob wrote that since renting the game would cost you more than the price of a pint, he asks the reader what would you plump for? A cool, crisp pint of continental fighting lager, or this rubbish game? In his case, he'd go with the pint. The last bit of criticism is how it barely even feels like it was a 3D game, with your characters moving in and out of a straight lines they walk in. And even they don't work quite right, at least for Rob anyway. He then knocked the game out with a 30% score, saying that Real Bout Fatal Fury is stale, slow, and they've seen it all before, along with the fact that there are too few characters, and the ones it does have are dull. Sticking with fighting games, we go to issue 32 for the review of Star Wars Masters of Teras, released in 1997. This was LucasArts' first attempt at a fighting game in the Star Wars universe, And boy, it shows. Really, this actually sounds like it's an easy sell. It's just a shame it didn't live up to its potential, as instead of being like Soul Calibur, it wound up being like Battle Arena Toshinden if it was programmed by a guy whose only game they ever played in his entire life was Color a Dinosaur on the NES. In spite of all this, the average score on Moby Games sits at a 63% based on 19 ratings. A Brazilian magazine, Super Game Power, gave the game a perfect score of 5 out of 5, while other scores ranged between 85% and 72%, with Das Officiel PlayStation magazine giving it a 2.1 out of 6, which translates to a 78%. Most of the other reviews were in between 75% and 42%, with the only poor rating from a magazine being a 2 out of 10 score from a French publication, Joypad. Rob definitely felt a disturbance in the force when he reviewed the game on issue 32, who criticized the odd choice of playable characters, the ring-out victories being too easy to achieve and too frequent, the lack of variety in movesets for each characters, the visuals looking like they fell off the ugly tree in Endor and hit every branch on the way down, and the game just being, well, dull. The game also caused real pain for the PlayStation Plus staff to see the mighty LucasArts logo stamped all over this, as it was like watching Shakespeare sign the license for official Hamlet bog roll. Then again, LucasArts never developed a fighting game before, so I can't blame them for trying something different for the first time. Rob ends his review with a 30%, stating that Masters of Terascasi is like someone squat carefully over your Star Wars collection and squeeze out a steaming dump onto it, as it was terrible to look at and even worse to play. For our next 30%er, we have Pax Corpus, developed by Cryo Interactive in 1997. This was originally intended to be a video game adaptation of Aeon Flux, with video previews to boot, and it would have been published by Viacom New Media. However, there were some problems that originated between Sony and the series creator Peter Chung, whom due to censorship issues apparently withdrew the license from Cryo, leaving them with an almost complete game that couldn't be released due to legal issues. Cutting their losses, Cryo fixed what they could with the story, made a few changes here and there, and Pax Corpus was the result. Maybe it wasn't worth all the trouble after all, given the terrible reception for the game on PC and PlayStation. With the exception of Megascore giving it a 72%, many reviews for the PlayStation version were pretty terrible, and PlayStation Plus gave us a pretty short review on issue 35, with Rob stating he'd seen better graphics on the fridge door of a Dotting Mom, while also criticizing the game's lack of atmosphere, slow pace, and dull combat. He gave it a 30%, saying that no rational human can want games like this to exist, calling it a big fat waste of time. We have another Psygnosis game on the video, and this time it's Sentinel Returns. Released in 1998 and developed by Hookstone, this is a sequel/remake to The Sentinel, which originally came out for the BBC Micro in 1986, which would later get ports for many platforms, with the Amiga version in particular seeing a modern re-release as one of the 25 built-in games on the A500 Mini. 26 if you count the inclusion of Time Bandit with the recent update. The gameplay is virtually the same, though modern hardware definitely adds some spice and speed to the highly original and surreal concept, with the famous horror movie director John Carpenter writing the music for the game. This one is very confusing and difficult to get to the grips if you're new to either the original or Sentinel Returns, and John's review from issue 36 did a decent job describing the basics of the game. So, word for word, you start at the bottom of a hilly landscape, absorb trees and boulders to make energy, use energy to make copies of yourself, then transport into these copies. Move up mountains, avoiding scans from the Sentinel being, get to the top, and you can absorb the Sentinel itself and move on to the next level. John still wasn't fond of this game, however, as he wrote that Sentinel Returns fell out of an ugly tree and hit every branch on the way down and got beaten unconscious by the boring stick, run over by a pointless car, and shot by the dull gun. He criticized the very idea of making a 3D remake of a game that came out when computers were, and I quote, made of stone and powered by springs. He finished the review with a score of 30%, stating that Sentinel Returns is hideous to look at, slow moving and really dull to play, and not even your old maths teacher who smoked a pipe and organized the chess club would enjoy this. I will level with you guys. I did play the demo of this game on issue 39 of the official UK PlayStation magazine, and even today, trying to understand this game, as well as the Amiga version of the original The Sentinel, was enough for me to say,
My brain hurts!
The iconic comic book Gauls are no strangers to the world of video games. After all, Asterix and Obelix made their way to a lot of consoles and computers, even dating back to the Atari 2600. A lot of European gamers might remember playing some of the games during the 8-bit and 16-bit generations, many of which were published by Infogrames. The PlayStation was treated to not one, not two, but 3 Asterix games at the turn of a millennium, starting with Asterix the Gallic War, or simply Asterix in the UK release. Released for the PlayStation in 1999 and ported to the PC the following year, this was developed by Sorcery Development, which was their only game they made before they were acquired by Warthog, the studio behind Tom and Jerry and House Trap, Star Trek Invasions, and Animaniacs The Great Edgar Hunt. The game had an average score of 60% on Moby Games, which seems to suggest the reviews were very mixed. Absolute PlayStation gave it a score of 78 out of 100 in their April 1999 issue, which concludes by saying that if you enjoyed the Risk board game, then Asterix may be worth checking out. However, the Swedish PlayStation magazine, or Svenska PlayStation Magasinet, gave it a 3 out of 10 in their June issue of that year. And then there's PlayStation Plus, with its review coming from issue 44. Rob was aware that this was the first PlayStation game in the Asterix series, and he was hoping it would be the last. The strategy bit was blasted by Rob for being disgustingly dull, saying it's like taking math lessons except you pay 40 quid. For platforming bits, they took a beating as well, with no points for graphics nor gameplay. He ended the review with a 30% rating, calling it insanely bad, stating that with the exception of Fade to Black, French games are always beyond dreadful, and this is up there with the best of them. Another game from Cryo Interactive, this time we have Virus It Is Aware, loosely based on the 1999 horror film Virus, which itself is based on a comic book by Dark Horse, who nowadays is one of the major pillars of Embracer Group. In this survival horror game, the player controls the female police officer John, who, along with her partner Sutter, investigates numerous murders of the hotel's inhabitants, only to discover that an alien electronic virus uses mechanical items to create robots, who in turn are built into the human corpses, creating zombie-type cyborgs. And they're definitely more dangerous than regular zombies, I'll tell you that right now. With the average score of 32% on Moby Games, it's no surprise that even the virus was aware of how bad the game is. PlayStation Plus was one of the publications whose review was written for issue 47. Rob was especially critical of the gameplay, as it's described as real bottom of the barrel stuff, as it's walk, shoot, press switch in its lowest and donkiest form, complete with mind-bogglingly dull, random and stupid combat, too many random death traps, and too many similar monsters. He concludes the review with a 30% rating, saying that if someone buys you this, they hate you, given this game is dull, uninspired, roughed around the edges, and annoying to play. Our last 30%er on this video is Castrol Honda Superbike Racing, developed by Interactive Entertainment and published in 1999 by THQ, with Electronic Arts handling the North American release. Based on Castrol Honda Superbike 2000, this is a racing sim that features the Honda RVF 750 RC45 and the riders Aaron Slight and Colin Edwards of the 1998 Superbike World Championship season. With the average score of 61% on Moby Games, this game is not exactly Gran Turismo, but for games involving superbikes, you could do a lot worse. At least Super Wegos, PS Extreme and Megafun gave it stellar reviews. PlayStation Plus, however, thought that it's not good enough, as it was reviewed on issue 47, which was also where we saw the review for Virus It Is Aware. Rich was given the keys to review the game, who considers the game a clumsy, crash-filled racer that's more pizza delivery than piece of action. He criticized the lack of customization or other bike models, the lack of variety for the tracks, the graphics that are as grainy as gravel-flavored Upland, and slow and ugly 2-player mode. The only thing it got right according to Rich was the difficulty levels, as it's one of the aspects of a game that actually works well. Rich ended the review with a 30% rating, and with hardly any bikes and lousy tracks, he calls this game seriously below standard, being slower than a convention of village idiots and uglier than roadkill. For our next segment, we have Atlantis: The Lost Tales, which is the third time on this video that Cryo Interactive got a beating from the publication. Originally released for DOS computers in 1997, it got ported to the PlayStation a year later, with the Saturn version being released during the same year as the DOS version. The original version on DOS and Windows was actually well received, with an average score of 72% on Moby Games. The PlayStation port, on the other hand, was a different story, as the average score is at 50% based on 8 ratings, with the only positive score coming from Power Unlimited, as they gave it a 7.6 out of 10 in their May 1999 issue. PlayStation Plus was not impressed with the port when they reviewed it on issue 41, with Lee saying that Atlantis The Lost Tales isn't entertainment, it's torture. Any adventure game worth its salt has a gripping storyline to keep you fascinated for the duration. But to Lee, it's not the case with Atlantis, as the story has no hook. Nothing to grab you by the family jewels and make you want to play the game. It's just plain dull. The staff at PlayStation Plus also wrote that even if adventure games are what gets you excited, you're really going to hate this game. I mean, sure, there are 3 discs worth of puzzles to get your head around, but with Tomb Raider 3 already out there and Silent Hill was already nearing release, they insist that you do not want to roll out the readies on this one. The review ends on a score of 29%, with Lee saying that it really is the most boring and tedious adventure game the PlayStation Plus crew ever had the misfortune to play, and it's going to put you in a coma for weeks. Another Acclaim offering on a video, this time it's Batman Forever. More specifically, the home version of a beat-em up that came out in the arcades in 1996, not the 16-bit game from a year prior. To avoid confusion for DOS and console owners, the home version was referred to on the box as Batman Forever, the arcade game. The game itself was developed by Acclaim Studios Austin, then known as Iguana Entertainment, the same studio behind the Turok series. Following Acclaim's bankruptcy in 2004, Iguana went down with it, resulting in their final game being worked on, the Red Star, being put on ice until Excess Games picked up the publishing rights and releasing it on PlayStation 2 in 2007 to a pretty positive reception, with the PSP version coming out in 2010. The game itself wasn't exactly the best beat-em up on the market in 1996, with the critics giving mostly okay-ish reviews. The PlayStation version in particular got a 48% average from 7 archived critic reviews on Moby Games, with the only positive review coming from Super Game Power, who gave it a 3.5 out of 5 in their February 1997 issue. The 2-page review from PlayStation Plus comes to us from issue 16, which starts by saying that the plot is nothing like that of a movie itself, as you simply play as Batman and Robin beating up generic thugs. The magazine wrote that the gameplay is very repetitive, unoriginal, simplistic, and most damningly has nothing to do with Batman whatsoever. The magazine also scolded the genuinely horrible graphics, the dreadful music, and even the price tag that it just says it costs too much. The opinion from TC states that if you like Batman and beat 'em ups, that is a good one, as long as you don't mind terrible games. TC also wrote that, shockingly, it was the only Batman game on the PlayStation at the time, and the only horizontally scrolling beat 'em up on the PlayStation to come out in PAL regions that time. Yet it certainly won't go down in history as being a great game. The magazine then slapped a rating of 28%, with music, animation, and graphics getting especially scathing scores. This double feature is going to be a treat, as not only we get a couple of games with a 27% rating, but we start with the first repeat on magazine videos. Let's begin with Crypt Killer, a Konami light gun shooter that got a score of 47% on the May 1997 issue of Sega Saturn Magazine UK. As I mentioned in the Sega Saturn Magazine video, the PlayStation version had better graphics than on the Saturn, though its controls are a lot weaker here. The review comes from Volume 2, Issue 7, which the review starts off by saying that light gun games have always, in the home market at least, been perceived as something a bit of a novelty item. In the arcade, they work just fine, but the additional purchase of a light gun for playing at home puts many console owners off. With the release of Die Hard Trilogy, there was enough interest for publishers to bring more light gun shooters to the PlayStation, with the likes of Midway's Area 51 and then upcoming ports of Lethal Enforcers, which we talked about earlier, and Namco's Time Crisis. Crypt Killer was meant to tide over the Gundams for a while until the said games came out, but there was a major problem. In the original arcade version, not only it could be played by 3 people at once, but you all held the big plastic pump-action shotguns instead of the usual pistols. These did not come to the PlayStation port, as only allowed for 2 players, and the light shotguns were not available for consoles for purchase. Once the game is stripped of its gimmicks, it got a huge beating from the magazine, as the game was criticized for laughably bad graphics, with the badly drawn, bitmapped monsters jerking toward you in a perfect example of useless animation, rampant clipping, and the game being overall dull. DB's opinion piece writes that calling this game drivel would be too kind, as the graphics embarrass the PlayStation console severely and gameplay is dull and repetitive, enough to make very average games like Area 51 look like Time Crisis, as well as calling it the kind of shameful release that could put many people off buying a light gun. Though in all fairness, Konami didn't have much to work with since the coin-up version was terrible anyway, at least according to DB. The game got a 27%, which is 20 points lower than Lee Nutter's review on Sega Saturn magazine, with the animation in particular getting a score of 18%. The other game to get a 27% rating is Attack of a Saucerman, a PAL exclusive release from Psygnosis. Chronologically speaking, this is the last game on the video to be reviewed in its original run before the magazine rebranded itself to PlayNation. And yes, the PlayNation era will come around for part 2, so stay tuned. Released in 1999, this was developed by Fube Industries, which was also their only game they ever made. The story follows Ed, a blue-collar worker from the alien world of Grimloid, who must travel to Earth to put an end to Netco and its plans to make Earthlings their staple food group. As one of the last games Psygnosis had published before they dropped out of the PC market in 2000, this got a really poor average score of 39% on Moby Games, with 4 out of 7 reviews being negative. JewVideo.com in particular gave it a 3 out of 20 in their online review from August 3rd, 1999. Rich reviewed the game on issue 47, as he had already started blasting the whole thing. He stated that the effort looks like it was knocked up by a GCSE computer student during a spare weekend, with the terrible graphics, the gameplay being repetitive to the point of stupidity, drab puzzles, hardly any enemies, and the platform bits being tired, boring, and crap. He ends the small review with a score of 27%, stating that given the fact it's hideous to look at and painful to play, if it was a dog, he'd take it out the back and shoot it, and several times, just to make sure. Next up, we have an import review that comes from the very first issue of PlayStation Plus magazine. Known in Japan as Gokujo Parodius da Deluxe Pack, Ultimate Parodius, as the magazine refers to it, is a compilation from 1994 that features arcade conversions of Parodius Da and Kokucho Parodius, also known as Fantastic Journey. Originally released as a launch title for the PlayStation in Japan, the compilation later saw a PAL release in 1995. MB starts off saying that upon loading Parodius, he had a horrible feeling that someone had snuck in during his lunch break and replaced the innards of a PlayStation with those of an old SNES, only to discover that he was simply playing a classic game. He knew this since all the old crusties in the office got excited when he mentioned it was coming in, only to wander away once it loaded up, mumbling, "Well, it used to be good anyway." The main problem with Parodius, according to MB, was that the graphics are overwhelming. Every color of a rainbow, and a few unclassified ones, flash before you, leaving you wondering what's background, what's foreground, what's good for you, what's bad for you, and even whether you've accidentally tuned the TV to the kids' cartoon channel. The review didn't have much else to say about this compilation, though it still gave the import a 26% rating, stating that this really was the weakest MB sampled on the PlayStation so far, and one to avoid. Emphasis on so far, as many later issues would certainly prove the PlayStation Plus crew wrong. What MB didn't seem to realize is the fact that almost everyone else adored the compilation. And don't take my word for it, the game's overall score on Moby Games is at an 85%, with the Saturn version alone getting a score of 87% based on 8 reviews. With the exception of a 6 out of 10 score for the PAL release from the official UK PlayStation Magazine's October 1995 issue, everyone else gave it fantastic scores all around, with Ultimate Future Games giving it a stellar score of 91 out of 100 in their February 1995 issue. Oh, and for the Saturn version on Moby Games, 8 ratings and absolutely no negative review in sight. The PlayStation version of Sensible Soccer, released in 1998, is based on the European Club Edition, which itself is a sequel to Sensible Soccer 98. Published by GD Interactive, this is another PAL-only release that not many people seem to be aware of. The PlayStation version didn't quite make a good impression with critics back in the day, with only 4 reviews being archived on Moby Games with a total of 35% overall. And as part of issue 42, Rob got his turn to give the red card to the game. Referred by the magazine as Sensible Soccer 2000, he criticized the game for the sickeningly awful graphics, the animations where players move like they're drugged and jerked like a sex offender in solitary, the awful game speed, and the fact that the game only uses one button like it was back then. He ended up giving a score of 25%, saying that there should be laws against digging up old, decomposing games and not doing anything to bring them up to the standard of then current technology. Better known in the US as Jet Moto 2, Jet Rider 2 is an arcade-like futuristic racer where you and your opponent pilot hoverpikes in a free-flying, chaotic race across diverse tracks to finish the line. Like its 1996 predecessor, this was developed by Singletrack, the same studio responsible for Warhawk and the first 2 Twisted Metal games. Unlike its predecessor, this was released exclusively for the PlayStation, so no PC version like last time. While the original Jet Moto saw an average score of 69% on Moby Games based on 22 ratings, the sequel is somewhat lower at a 64% based on 17 ratings. Most gave it pretty darn good reviews, while the rest found it to be average. For the March 1998 issue, John was pretty harsh toward this one, as he wrote that for a sport that you would think it would be fun, single track made jet bike riding as interesting as listening to old folks talk about the price of fish. He first criticized the tracks, saying Jet Rider 2 sorely lacks imagination, as each track seems to tick every box on the list of racing game cliches, while also saying that although coming up with a roller coaster track was cool, the poor execution meant that the magic moment was lost. Another point of his criticism was that Jet Rider 2 looks about as attractive as a bearded lady. Riders and scenery are garish and messy, there is no character, subtle shading, lightning effects, or inspiration. He ends the review with a 23% rating, stating that no one needs this game in their collection, calling it a disgrace to the PlayStation that should never see the light of day. Still, if you want to form your own opinion that could be a lot better than what John wrote, whether you call it Jet Rider or Jet Moto, the first two games in the trilogy are available on the PlayStation Store for PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, complete with trophy support. We now have one more acclaimed title to talk about, this time being another repeat on the video. And frankly, it's not the last time that Acclaim will get a whipping from PlayStation Plus, as we'll find out in part 2. Like I mentioned on the Sega Saturn magazine video, Iron Man and EXO Manowar in Heavy Metal got a score of 33% in April 1996 issue. As we know, it was a collaboration between Marvel and Valiant Comics, who was Acclaim's comics division at the time, that brings us Iron Man and EXO Manowar, although they bear little resemblance to what they actually look like in the comics. The PlayStation Plus review, which comes from Volume 2, Issue 6, starts out stating the glaring problem with superhero games in the early to mid-90s. With very few exceptions, like the ones from Capcom, every single game based on a superhero license released has simply been a crap cash-in, especially on 16-bit platforms. And like Batman Forever from earlier and The Incredible Hulk, the Pantheon Saga, all we got for this crossover is yet another side-scrolling beat-em-up. The problems started with the graphics, with the shoddy backgrounds and laughably poor animations. EXO in particular walks as if he has some serious arthritis on his shoulders that prevents his arms from touching the sides of his body, resulting in him walking like a zombie with a heavily starched shirt. Apart from the gripes about the originality and graphics not being that great, the review also states that the problem is the fact that this whole game just looks like another crap license being done for the sake of money, even though Iron Man isn't as big as, say, Spider-Man at the time. The review wrote that it looks like an exercise in lazy by-the-numbers game development, which begs the question that if you're going to do a game which is in a genre that has been done to death, then it has to have some reason to stand out from the pack. Iron Man and EXO Manowar in Heavy Metal didn't, with the boring and repetitive gameplay since it's been seen many times before, and it's certainly been done better. The game wound up with a score of 22%, which is 11% lower than on SSM, with lastability being at 20%. Our next segment brings us to 3 games that share the same score of 21%, starting with our last Japanese import on the video. Developed by Technosoft and released in 1995 as a Japanese exclusive, Reverfian is a third-person arena-based action game that pits 2 mechanized creatures against one another. Reverfian plays very similarly to Sega's contemporary hit Virtual On, and includes 8 playable characters, each with their own unique moveset and abilities. Interestingly, the game has absolutely no archived reviews on Moby Games whatsoever, so I have no idea if it was good or bad according to magazines or critics. It's an import that's so obscure, the only English review I can find was from PlayStation Plus. Coming from the 5th issue, SM stated the review by saying that he should have known better when he saw the early screenshots of the game, as it gave him the impression of a Cyber Sled clone that looked far superior to the Namco game in every aspect. Replacing Cyber Sled's titular vehicles with an assortment of well-realized robotic insects, birds and reptiles, the basic idea is identical to that of a Namco game, with the player confined within a square play area and left to battle it out with another entrant from the 8 on offer. Familiar as it may be, he wrote that while Reverfian pretends to be an enhancement of an already average Cyber Sled idea, it fails because of 2 major issues. The action being limited to a game of hide and seek, and the CPU-controlled robots following a very predictable attack pattern, thus making the patented PlayStation Plus Crazy Ivan technique of sidestepping enemy shots while unleashing bolt after bolt as the often static foe becomes the order of the day. Although it was graphically superb, SM still wrote that for a game that aims to leapfrog an already tired idea, it even falls at that first hurdle and results in a game with very little to redeem it. It seems that to SM, it failed to beat Namco's Cyber Sled at its own game, which may explain Reverfian's 21% score overall. The second 21%er on this segment is Spice World, which was released in 1998. While Psygnosis published the game in the US, Sony themselves handled the distribution in PAL regions. Spice World is a music game about the British quintet, the Spice Girls, released at the peak of their success and prior to the departure of Gary Halliwell for a solo career. You choose your favorite Spice Girl and use samples from their songs to create your own song. If you can call them songs anyway. The next stage is to practice your dance moves, and the final stage has you put both together and all 5 Spice Girls rehearse for their live show, with you controlling who dances which moves and the camera views. This particular oddity was developed by Team Soho, the Sony studio who also worked on Porsche Challenge, Rapid Racer, and The Getaway. The studio was later merged with Sony's Camden studio, who previously developed Kingsley's Adventure sometime in 2002 to become Sony's London studio, who will be best known for SingStar and iToy. Unfortunately, the company was shut down in February of 2024 as a result of Jim Ryan's misguided leadership as Sony CEO, with their final game being Blood and Truth, a PlayStation VR game from 2019. Regarding critical reception, Spice World got a 41% average score on Moby Games based on 15 ratings. With the exception of shockingly stellar reviews from Absolute PlayStation and the Swedish magazine Powerplay, the game got appropriately terrible scores. So much so, it won the award for Worst Music, as well as a runner-up award for Number 1 Game We Love to Hate for EGM's 1999 Buyer's Guide. Leave it to Andrew to come up with a hilariously catharic critique from issue 35 of PlayStation Plus magazine, with the first thing saying that things were going a bit Pete Tong for girl power, Ginger's buggered off, all Saints are trouncing them in the chart walls, and now they've put their names on this pile of puke. Like, close the door on your way out, hey girls? With barely any gameplay whatsoever, Andrew also wrote that the only mixing the Spice Girls should be doing is in concrete, given that there are only 18 segments of a song to dance to it. The mixing bit, if you can call them that, are a real yawnorama, as you just stand on blocks to select bits of a song, then remember which bits where so you can do your own remix, quote unquote, that's guaranteed to become an industrial strength irritation machine. And dancing? It's just remembering which button to press, and that's it. And you know the game was pants when the PlayStation Plus staff wrote that some of the crew members thought Spice World the movie was a laugh and a half. Needless to say, Spice World got a well-deserved score of 21%, with Andrew saying that it's short, boring, unimaginative, and has nothing in it even the most rabid Spice fan would want. For our last game on this segment, we have Rugrats Search for Reptar, released in 1998 and published by THQ. Based on a popular Nickelodeon cartoon, this was also developed by N-Space, the studio behind Duke Nukem Time to Kill and Bugriders that we got to talk about earlier. What makes this one particularly funny is the fact that both this and Time to Kill were released in the same month of October 1998. The Rugrats PlayStation debut saw a mixed reception, with a 61% average score on mobile games based on 14 ratings. The highest score comes from PlayStation Pro, a UK magazine, with an 8 out of 10 rating from their June 1999 issue, while CVG gave it the lowest score of 2 out of 5. PlayStation Plus sunk the game even deeper with the review from issue 43, with Andrew yet again writing the review. So far as they will be bothered to tell, the point of Rugrats Search for Reptar is to move a badly animated Rugrat around what passes for a house and pick up pieces of a puzzle, which can only be earned by completing a series of minigames, which, to Andrew, each one of them is unbelievably bad. He ended the review with a 21% score, which he writes that you don't need them to tell you to give this game a wide berth next time it passes you in the streets. Another PAL exclusive oddity is up next on the video. Developed by Seamies Limited and published by Grolier Interactive in 1998, Xenocracy is a cross between a space combat action sim, somewhat like Colony Wars, and a political strategy game. In the near future, 4 planetary superpowers, the Earth Dominion, the Mercury League, the Venus Alliance, and the Mars combined, are vying for control of a star system and on the brink of an all-out thermostellar war. As commander of the United Planet Nations Peacekeeping Fighter Squadron, your role is to maintain the balance and prevent Cold War and localized conflicts from escalating into open interplanetary hostilities. Further complicating the matter, you also must deal with pirates and a looming alien threat. While the PC version saw an average of 70% from 12 ratings on mobile games, the PlayStation version was at a much lower 59%. Even with the same number of ratings. With the exception of out of this world reviews from Absolute PlayStation, Game Express, Power Unlimited, and Now Gamer, the rest of the critics found it to be a mixed bag. Joypad gave it a 2 out of 10 in their October 1998 issue, and it looks like PlayStation Plus has the same feeling towards Xenocracy when Rob reviewed it on issue 34. Things go off to a bad start with a header that reads, "The longest loading times ever for this." High-octane blast-em-up action with a tinge of heavy-duty space opera sounds good, but as Rob puts it, it would have been if it hadn't been programmed by chimps. He especially doesn't like the fact that Broiler Interactive was charging 40 quid for a game that looks about as fresh and attractive as Bet Lynch. The sun looks like a yellow dinner plate, the lights flaring across your screen look like a row of snooker balls, spaceships look like blotchy cereal boxes, and everything jerks around big style throughout. Rob then gave it a 20% score, stating that Xenography is beyond the realms of mere bollocks, being graphically abysmal and a real pedigree dog to play. So what I'm getting at is, just stick with Colony Wars. Another rental-only release coming up, and it's another port of a fighting game from SNK. Knowing the review score this one got, it's safe to say that things are going to get ugly. Much like real Bout Fatal Fury, the PlayStation port of Samurai Shodown III Blades of Blood only had its PAL release available as a rental. But unlike Fatal Fury, its PAL release was sold for keeps in Spain, Portugal, and Greece instead of Germany, as far as I know, and its PlayStation port did make it to North America. Nick reviewed the game on issue 32, starting off by saying that unlike real samurai, who are thoughtful, dedicated, and graceful, the samurai in this game are jerky as hell and really rather bad at actual combat. First, he wrote that if you wanted gameplay, you should just get Tekken 2 or Soul Blade, whereas Samurai Shodown 3 is for those who want slow and frustrating. He wrote that it's high on impossible to play, with more success coming from random button pushing than tactics. His critique toward the character's jerky movement, as well as a lack of moves and combos, didn't help matters. He also wrote that Samurai Shodown 3 looks like a dodgy beat 'em up from the days when game consoles were the size of a small continent, and it moves as jerkily as a Michael Jackson dance routine, which is a bad thing. He also wrote that games like this make the PlayStation look crap. Graphics, sound, and gameplay are, in his words, appalling, and when you compare it to something like Resident Evil 2, it's difficult to believe that these two are on the same machine. He concluded his review with a score of 19%, commenting that even as a rental-only game, this just ain't worth time and money, suggesting that you'd avoid it like a dribbling, smelly tramp walking towards you with a sign carrying herpes carrier. The first game on this segment, which is about games that got an 80% rating, may be familiar to those who saw the Negative Ions guest segment on my Jaguar CD Retro Achievements rollout video. But for the uninitiated, Braindead 13 is an open-ended interactive movie from Readysoft that first began life on MS-DOS before being ported to consoles, including the PlayStation. It functions similarly to Dragon Slayer, but it happens to allow for more exploration, as well as having more comedy and violence on display. The review from PlayStation Plus is 2 pages long, which is a lot for an FMV game. So, to cut to the chase, the magazine gave it high marks for the graphics and animation, especially when you consider they were drawn by the professional animators who previously worked on cartoons like Beetlejuice, as well as equally high marks for music and sound. But being an FMV game, lastability and playability took a serious nosedive. The first comment from Alex criticized Braindead 13 for gameplay being far from involving, since you need to tap the right direction at the right time to avoid certain death, and the incredibly linear nature making the alternative routes pointless. Steve's comment wrote that the big problem is the majority of a game is a matter of trial and error, the latter of which soon irritating beyond belief. While he did appreciate the fact that Readysoft tried to add variety to what is essentially a multiple choice quiz by allowing you to pick routes between sections, Braindead 13 is nothing more than an exercise in graphics, while also saying that when you consider the likes of Tekken and Resident Evil marry beautiful aesthetics with involving gameplay, Braindead 13 is a very redundant piece of software. PlayStation Plus gave it an overall score of 18%, though I imagine a score of 13% will have been a bit too on the nose. Oh, and unlike the Jaguar CD version, this game comes in 2 discs. So there's that too. What's interesting about the PlayStation version is that this is another game on the video whose PAL version, despite being reviewed, never actually released. According to PlayStation Plus, the PAL version will have been published by Empire Interactive, the same company that published Ghostmaster, Flat Out, and Ford Racing series, but apparently those plans must have went south. I'd blame it on Fritz if I were you. Released in 1999 and published by Sunsoft, Shanghai True Valor is a continuation of Activision's take on Mahjong Solitaire, as well as the first in the series to be in 3D. The True Valor title, in case you were wondering, comes from the following story. Many years ago, there was a land called the Dragon Kingdom. This land was ravaged by endless wars, and its people were left starving from hunger. This story is a tale of a brave warrior who single-handedly united the Dragon Kingdom through skill, perseverance, and true valor. From the German magazines that did review the game, they did give pretty high scores according to Moby Games. However, while EGM and GameSpot gave it scores of 25.5 out of 40 and 5.7 out of 10 respectively, Lee's PlayStation Plus review from issue 41 was a lot more harsh. While the 3D mode was a lot more interesting to look at, and a great deal tougher at that, he still wrote that the 3D shenanigans failed to mask what inane, boring, monotonous, tedious Chinese toss this really is. He ended the short review with a score of 18%, saying that it's a piss poor puzzle game which should be avoided like a very bad dose of a clap, and that you shouldn't buy it, rent it, or even look at it. One of the more bizarre PAL exclusives to release in 1998, Frenzy is a 3D shoot-'em-up from Sales Curve Interactive, or SCI, in which the player controls a small biplane. Flying through the levels, the player has to prevent an evil baron from taking control of a world with his doomsday device. Flying over to Moby Games, the game got an average score of 49% based on 8 reviews, with Now Gamer being the only publication to give a decent score. The rest mostly found it confusingly mid. Joypad in particular gave it a 2 out of 10 in their July 1998 issue, saying that Frenzy is only a crazy shoot-'em-up for about 20 minutes, which becomes a ruptured aneurysm after that. Andrew, who reviewed the game on issue 34, made a better description for Frenzy, calling it a game that's worth 34 pence, all knocked up by a Les Dennis fan in his lunch hour one Friday afternoon. His first criticism is regarding gameplay, saying that every level boils down to just shooting everything that moves. The zany, wacky antics were described by Andrew as the sort of industrial strength comedy offspring of every comic relief fundraiser, every Frag Week student, the Chuckle Brothers, Freddie Starr, and those rubbish children's TV presenters on ITV, and it grates like having someone run sandpaper along your nuts. With a lack of variety, no extra modes or 2-player, short and samey levels, lousy music, and the fact that SCI was charging almost 35 quid for it, Andrew ended his review with a score of 16%, stating that Frenzy should be driven down a long road in the country, forced to kneel, then shot through the back of the head, which should do the job of wiping this stupid grin off his face. Our last Double Dipper brings us one last soccer game to start off this segment. Released in 1997, 442 Soccer was developed by Arc Developments Limited, the same studio behind Johnny Bazooka Tone, and published by Virgin Interactive. Much like Reverfian, there were no archived critic reviews on Moby Games, so PlayStation Plus is the only magazine to give it a proper review. Steve reviewed 442 Soccer in the October 1997 issue, who criticized the game for its simplistic control scheme, the tackling being hit and miss, and especially the graphics. The players look like they've been nicked from a Subtale set and move around the pitch at absurdly fast speeds. He ended the review with an astonishingly low score of 14%, calling it football in name only, and that 442 Soccer is an absolute disgrace of a game which plays as badly as it looks. He even went as far as to call it one of the worst PlayStation games of all time, and it should be avoided like a Roy Keane tackle. Holding the same score of 14% is a first-person shooter that I am sure none of you have ever heard of. Originally released in Japan in 1997 by SPS Co., Hybrid was brought over to Europe in 2001 by Midas Interactive. Judging by the year the issue came out, I imagine it was going to be released in Europe sometime in 1998. Hybrid was developed by Motive Time, a game development company associated with Elite Systems, who are best known for making games for the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64. In fact, not only their next game after Hybrid was the original PC version of Ford Racing, but it was also their last, as the company just disappeared from the public eye. Maybe they went out of business after that, but Elite Systems still exists today, apparently. Much like 442 Soccer, there are no archived critic scores over at Moby Games for Hybrid, so I guess we'll have to look at the January 1998 issue of PlayStation Plus magazine. And oh boy, Jim sure has a lot to say on this game. While there are some terrible games out there, we can usually find something nice to say about them. But to be honest, Hybrid got the PlayStation Plus writing staff stomped. The first point of contention was the gameplay, or rather, lack thereof. It's a standard Doom style game, except the character moves really badly, the enemies being rubbish, the lack of originality, and just being painful to play. The visuals in particular were the highlight of ridicule, as Hybrid manages to have probably the worst graphics ever seen in a PlayStation game. With blocky weapons, rough looking levels, and awful enemies, Jim wrote that this is a game you don't want to admit buying, unless you want all your mates to laugh at you. He concluded the review with a score of 14%, who had this bit to say in the end regarding Hybrid. Come on, is someone taking the piss out of us? This is awful, terrible, and atrocious. The worst PlayStation game ever created. With no exceptions. Enough said. But since we only have 2 more games on this video, Jim and the rest of the PlayStation Crew magazine were so mistaken. As the final appearance for Cryo Interactive on this video, Versailles 1685 was originally released for PC in 1996, with the PlayStation port coming out in April of 1998. While Cryo published the game themselves in the UK, it was published in France by Canal Plus Multimedia. In this historical game, you take on the role of a security guard at the court of Louis XIV. Your mission is to prevent a destruction of such a lovely place as Versailles, where you search for a bomb and the person that wants to activate it. The PlayStation port has an average score of 70% on Moby Games based on 8 reviews, which is surprisingly decent for a historical point-and-click adventure game. Even the worst scores it got didn't go below 60%, with the exception of PlayStation Plus obviously, with its review that comes from issue 35. And the fact that it got a worse rating than Spice World, which has almost no gameplay whatsoever, really says a lot. Right off the bat, Rob called Versailles 1685 as scientifically proven to be more boring than Songs of Praise. As a man dressed in a curtain with a truly enormous wig, you move between still images of a place, talking to crappily animated cretins, picking up objects, reading loads of text, the usual stuff. What Rob did not like in particular was the game is meant to be educational. Like it's gonna improve your mind to read endless little bits of guff about what a bunch of posh frog twits from 300 years ago did in their leisure time. In all honesty, if I would have wanted to learn about the posh people from 300 years ago and their activities, I would have spent time reading horrible histories or watching its TV series. He ended the review with a score of 10%, calling it frighteningly dull, badly put together and educational, while also asking if games this bad are allowed to exist, how can there be a god? And now we reach the final game for part 1, with a game that PlayStation Plus magazine considers not only worse than Bubsy 3D, but also a candidate for the worst PlayStation game to ever crawl out from under a rock. And that game was Saban's Is No Good. First released in 1997 for PC and MS-DOS, with the PlayStation port coming out the following year, this was a colorful 2D platformer with some snappy animation and 3D rendered sprites, following on the heels of the Is No Good cartoon series from 1994, which itself is based on the comics by the late Asterix creator René Goscinny. In fact, this was the second attempt at adapting the exploits of a wicked Grand Vizier Is No Good in video game form. A decade earlier, there was an Is No Good game by Infogrames, which was released for DOS, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and Thomson MO/TO computers. You take control of Grand Vizier Is No Good, whose one and only aim is to dispose of Caliph of Baghdad and become Caliph in his place. In his words,
"I want to be Sultan instead of the Sultan!"
This very colorful platform game involves a lot of moving, jumping, dodging, and ducking obstacles all around you, all while you are on a timer. You can pick up objects that increase your life points as well as weapons which you can throw at your many opponents, and each level has a level boss that you must defeat to move on to the next level. Saban's Is No Good certainly lives up to its name, and not in a good way, as the game, especially its PlayStation port, got a massive trashing by critics. And the lowest score it got comes from PlayStation Plus, when John reviewed this game on issue 31. Literally everything was criticized within this small review. The lack of quality, the graphics being rougher than a 6-year-old sketchbook, dull and frustrating to play, and the fact that Microids had the nerve to sell it for 40 quid. And the most embarrassing fact about this 2D platformer? This came out the same year as the PAL release of Klonoa Door to Phantomile, which was far better in every sense of a word possible. And it certainly sold better than this game too. In the end, John gave Saban's Is No Good a score of 9%, the lowest score the magazine could ever possibly give out, saying that calling this game Is No Good doesn't do it justice, and that the only way you'll enjoy this is if you've had your brain removed. Just play Klonoa instead.